Oak. He carried her out of a burning barn on the night her father sold her debt to the most dangerous man in Haskell County. She thought he was just another hired hand collecting what was owed. She had no idea he had been quietly keeping her alive for 3 years, without her ever knowing his name. The autumn of 1879 had arrived in the Texas Hill Country with the particular cruelty it reserved for people who couldn't afford to suffer it. Oak. The cedar breaks along the Llano River had turned the color of old rust, and the water in the seasonal creek beds had pulled back to nothing but cracked mud and the bones of dead catfish. For Emmett Pryor and his wife Nell, the dry season wasn't a hardship. It was a verdict. Emmett had borrowed $340 from a man named Calhoun Drexler 18 months prior, staking the loan against his 60-acre plot and the modest peach orchard that occupied the eastern quarter of it. Oak. Drexler was a land broker from San Antonio who operated with the smooth, deliberate patience of a man who expected to collect one way or another. He held paper on 11 properties across 3 counties and had never once extended a deadline out of sympathy. On a gray Wednesday morning in October, Drexler arrived at the Pryor homestead in a lacquered black buggy with a hired man riding alongside him. Oak. He wore a gray wool suit despite the lingering heat and carried a leather satchel that contained, among other things, the signed deed to the Pryor farm. Inside the house, standing near the dry sink with a dish towel in her hands, was Annalisa Pryor. At 22, she had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn jaw, and she had spent the better part of her life learning to read the weather on a man's face before he opened his mouth. Oak. She watched through the warped glass of the kitchen window as her father removed his hat and began talking too fast, his hands moving in that particular way they did when he was losing an argument he hadn't prepared for. Drexler listened with his arms folded and his chin tipped slightly upward. He shook his head once. Then he said something that made Emmett's shoulders drop like a man who had just been told the doctor couldn't help him. Annalise set down the dish towel and walked to the door. Oak. The conversation in the yard had already reached its ugly center by the time she stepped onto the porch. Drexler was speaking in the clipped, businesslike tone of someone reciting a contract clause rather than ruining a family's life. "The note is due and the land doesn't cover the full balance," Drexler said, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve with precise, bored fingers. Oak. "However, I have a business arrangement in mind that settles the remaining $95 and keeps your family in the house through spring." Emmett turned to look at his daughter on the porch, and in that look Annalise understood everything before a single word was spoken. "My associate in Fredericksburg," Drexler continued, "operates a boarding house and needs a capable woman to manage the domestic operations. Oak. A 2-year contract would clear your ledger entirely." Annalise had heard of Drexler's associate in Fredericksburg. Every woman in the county had. The boarding house was not a boarding house in any honest sense of the word. Before her father could answer, before her mother could come running from the back room where she'd been listening, a low and unhurried voice spoke from the direction of the barn. "I'll cover the $95. Every head in the yard turned. Oak. Leaning against the far corner of the barn's open doorway, one shoulder resting on the weathered timber like he'd been standing there long enough to hear the whole conversation and had simply been waiting for the right moment, was a man Annalisa had seen exactly twice in her life and never spoken to directly. His name was Corbett Lane. He was known in the hill country the way a particular landmark is known, not by reputation so much as by simple, undeniable presence. Oak. He ran a remote cattle operation up in the cedar breaks above the Llano, a day's hard ride from town, and he came down twice a year to sell stock and buy provisions. He was 31 years old, deeply weathered, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had been shaped by wind and silence rather than conversation. Oak. A faded gray kerchief hung at his throat, and his hat brim was tilted low. But his eyes, pale and steady as creek water in January, were fixed on Drexler with the kind of attention that made smaller men remember their manners. "That's not your business, Lane," Drexler said, though the confidence in his voice had gone slightly thin. "Man's in debt. I'm offering to settle it." Corbett pushed off the barn post and walked slowly across the yard. Oak. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced a folded envelope. He held it out toward Drexler. "There's a bank draft in there for $95. It's drawn on First National in Kerrville. You can verify it today if you ride hard." Drexler didn't reach for it immediately. "And what exactly do you want in return for that kind of generosity?" Corbett looked at Emmett, not at Drexler, not at Annalisa. Oak. at her father, man to man, with a directness that was somehow more respectful than anything Drexler had managed in 20 minutes. "A fair arrangement," Corbett said. "The girl comes to work the homestead up on my spread through the winter. Cook, keep the house, tend the kitchen garden. Come spring thaw, the debt's clear and she goes where she chooses." He paused. "She'll be housed, fed, kept safe. That's more than Fredericksburg offers." The silence in the yard sat heavy as wet wool. Oak. Annalise stared at the back of Corbett Lane's head and felt the particular cold that has nothing to do with temperature. She had heard of arrangements like this. They were called practical. They were called temporary. They never were. Her father took the envelope. Drexler counted the bank draft, clicked his satchel shut, tipped his hat without warmth, and climbed back into his lacquered buggy. Oak. He drove away without a backward glance, the way a man does when he has already moved on to the next property on his list. Annalise's mother wept quietly in the kitchen doorway. Her father couldn't look her in the eye. Corbett Lane stood in the center of the yard and waited, hat in hand, with the particular patience of someone who has learned not to crowd a frightened animal. "You have an hour," he said to Annalise, his voice neither hard nor soft. "Pack what matters. Oak. The trail gets rough after the second ridge, and I'd rather make the upper crossing before dark." She packed her grandmother's quilt, 3 dresses, a pair of worn boots her mother had resold twice, and a small tin box that contained a faded daguerreotype and a folded letter she hadn't been able to throw away. She did not look at Corbett Lane during the first day of riding. Oak. She sat straight on the borrowed roan mare and kept her gaze on the cedar-covered ridgelines, cataloging every landmark in case she needed to find her way back on foot. He rode 15 feet ahead of her and said nothing, except to call out a rocky section of trail or a low branch. Oak. On the second afternoon, as the elevation rose and the air thinned, and the temperature dropped with the abruptness that the hill country highlands were known for, a cold north wind came down off the escarpment and went straight through Annalise's thin wool coat like it wasn't there. She said nothing. Her jaw ached from clenching it against the shivering. Corbett reined in his horse at the crest of a cedar ridge. Oak. He turned in the saddle, looked at her once, and without a word untied the heavy canvas duster from behind his saddle roll. He rode back alongside her and held it out. She stared at it. "Take it," he said. "Frostbite's no use to either of us." She took the coat. It fell past her knees and smelled of cedar smoke and dry grass and something clean she couldn't name. She pulled it around her and didn't thank him, because she hadn't decided yet what she owed him. Oak. "Why are you doing this?" she asked instead. The first words she had spoken directly to him since leaving the homestead. He was already facing forward again, studying the trail ahead. "Doing what? Paying $95 for a woman you've never spoken to." He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "I've spoken to you," he said finally. "You just don't remember." She frowned at the back of his hat. "I would remember." He said nothing more. Oak. The homestead, when they reached it at dusk on the third day, was not what she had imagined. She had been braced for a crude lean-to, a dirt floor, the particular squalor of a man living alone in the wilderness without anyone to impose order on his habits. What she found instead was a well-built limestone and cedar house with a proper shake roof, 2 glazed windows facing south, and a stone chimney that was already drawing smoke in a clean, steady column. Oak. A kitchen garden, dormant but carefully fenced against deer, ran along the east wall. The small barn was tidy and smelled of clean hay. 3 dogs of mixed origin came to greet the horses with wagging tails and no particular alarm. Corbett showed her the house without ceremony. A main room with a cast-iron stove, a plank table, 2 chairs, and bookshelves built into the wall. Actual bookshelves, filled with actual books, which surprised her enough that she stopped walking for a moment. Oak. A side room with a narrow bed, a washstand, a braided rug, and a window that looked out into the cedar break. "This is yours," he said, nodding at the side room. "Where do you sleep?" "Main room." He pointed to a narrow rope bed folded against the far wall. "I'm up before light anyway. Doesn't matter." He left her to settle in and went to see to the horses. Annalise stood in the center of her small room and let the silence of the place settle around her. Oak. She was alone, she was afraid, and she was in the house of a man she did not know. She walked to the washstand to rinse the trail dust from her face. The basin was clean. A folded linen towel sat beside it, pressed flat with the kind of deliberate care that struck her as strange in a man living alone. She dried her hands and turned toward the small shelf above the washstand where a few modest items sat. A tin cup, a folded bandana, a half-burned candle stub, and a brooch. Oak. It was a small thing, oval, with a pressed tin frame the color of old pewter. The glass front was cracked along one corner. Inside the glass, behind it, was pressed a tiny dried wildflower, a bluebonnet, its petals still faintly purple despite years of fading. Annalise's breath stopped. She reached out and picked it up with 2 fingers, turning it over. On the back, scratched into the tin in rough block letters, were 3 words. For the girl. The world tilted. She was 7 years old again, sitting on the bank of the Pedernales River after nearly drowning in the spring flood. A boy, older than her, maybe 15, lean and serious-faced, had waded into the current and pulled her out by the wrist. He had sat beside her in the mud while she coughed river water and shook, and when she had finally stopped crying, he had pressed something into her palm to distract her. A brooch that had belonged to his mother. He had told her to keep it, that his mother wouldn't need it anymore, and that the girl who almost drowned in the Pedernales probably needed a piece of luck more than the dead did. She had lost the brooch a year later in a house fire that took the eastern half of their first homestead. Annalise turned and stared at the closed door of the main room, at the thin strip of firelight visible beneath it. It couldn't be the same man. 12 years had passed. The boy from the river had been traveling through with a cattle drive and had disappeared with the herd by morning. She had never learned his name. She looked down at the brooch again. For the girl. She did not sleep for a long time. The next morning she found him at the plank table before dawn, with a cup of coffee and a worn almanac open in front of him. He looked up when she came in. His expression didn't change, but his eyes tracked to her hands, to the brooch she was holding. Where did you get this? She said. It wasn't a question. He looked at it for a moment, then he looked at her. The firelight from the stove caught the pale steadiness of his eyes, and she saw something there she hadn't expected. Not guilt, not pretense, but a plain and undefended weight, the look of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and has stopped trying to hide the effort of it. Pedernales River, he said. Spring of 67. The silence in the room was total. You were 7, Corbett said. Flood had come down fast off the limestone plateau and the crossing washed out without warning. You went in near the old Cottonwood crossing. I was riding drag on a Longhorn Drive moving north. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. I got you out. You were scared half to death, and you wouldn't stop shaking, so I gave you the brooch to look at. It had been my mother's. She was dead, Annalise said quietly. 6 months by then. Fever. How did you end up here? Her voice was barely above a whisper. How did you end up on my father's road? Corbett set the coffee cup down. He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man arranging facts that he has rehearsed privately many times but never said aloud. After the drive ended in Abilene, I had nothing to go back to. My father had remarried and sold the family land. I came south again, drifted through the hill country, liked the cedar breaks, liked the quiet. Bought this acreage with 2 seasons of trail wages, built the house. He looked toward the south window, which was beginning to show the pale gray of early dawn. I came through your father's county every spring selling stock. 3 years ago I saw you in town outside the dry goods. I recognized you by the way you held yourself. Same jaw, same eyes. He paused. I didn't speak, didn't seem like my place. But you knew, Annalise said. You knew my father was in debt to Drexler. Word travels. He looked at the table. I heard what Drexler was planning, heard it at the stockyards in Kerrville in August, heard the name of his associate in Fredericksburg. A muscle moved in his jaw. I had $95 in savings. The full weight of that sentence settled on her. Not a fortune, not easy money. 3 years of hard-range work in a single envelope handed to a land broker without hesitation. You spent everything you had, she said. It's only money, he said in the flat, unadorned tone of a man who means exactly what he says and nothing more. Kept it for land improvement. Land improves either way. He looked at her then, directly, without flinching. I wasn't going to let them send you to Fredericksburg. She didn't have words for what moved through her in that moment, so she sat down in the second chair and held the brooch in her lap, and let the fire snap and breathe between them while the dawn came up slow and gray outside the window. Winter in the cedar breaks above the Yalano River arrived early that year and stayed mean. By December, the creek below the homestead had frozen at the edges, and the white-tailed deer came down from the high cedar and stood in the kitchen garden fence, looking in with their large, patient eyes. Corbett hunted before dawn and butchered clean and wasted nothing. Annalise rendered the tallow, smoked the venison, put up the last of the dried herbs she'd found in the kitchen garden, and kept the stove burning through the long black nights. Oak. He taught her to read the sky for weather, the way a farmer reads it. Not the town version, but the real version. The way a particular shade of yellow in the northwest meant ice by midnight. The way cedar waxwings moving together down the ridge meant a cold front inside of 6 hours. She taught him that bread took longer to rise above 1,800 feet, and that he'd been burning the bottom of every loaf he'd baked for 3 years because he hadn't adjusted the stove draft for elevation. He accepted this information without embarrassment, which she found she appreciated more than she expected to. They ate at the plank table every evening by lamplight, at first in near silence, then in the kind of silence that is no longer uncomfortable. Then, gradually, in conversation, about the books on his shelves, about the families they had come from, about the particular loneliness of growing up in a place where the land is more permanent than the people. She learned that he had taught himself to read from a mail-order Bible at 14 and had never stopped. She learned that the 3 dogs had individual names and distinct personalities that he had cataloged with serious precision. She learned that he had once, during the worst year of a 7-year drought, given away a season's worth of hay to a neighboring family whose cattle were dying, and had said nothing about it to anyone. He learned that she had kept her grandmother's recipe for apple butter in her head since age 9, because the paper copy had burned in the house fire. He learned that she had wanted to teach school, but there hadn't been money for the certification. He learned that she was not afraid of silence, but had been afraid for a long time of being invisible in it. On a clear January night, with the temperature below 0, and the stars so dense and close they seemed to press down through the cedar tops, the horses began screaming in the barn. Corbett was on his feet and armed before the last echo of the sound. He told her to bolt the door and stay low. She bolted it, and then she went to the south window and watched through the glazed glass. The lantern he carried swung in a yellow arc across the frozen yard. She saw the barn doors standing open, the horses bunched at the far wall, and then she saw what had come through the gap in the fence. A wolf, gaunt as a winter shadow, its ribs showing through its pelt like barrel staves. It was large, desperate, and it had cornered the smaller of Corbett's 2 roan mares against the timber wall. Corbett raised his rifle. The wolf, sensing the new threat, turned and launched itself with the speed of a starving thing that has nothing left to lose. The lantern hit the hay-covered floor and shattered, and for 3 terrible seconds there was only darkness and the sound of a struggle she could not see. A single shot cracked through the cold, then nothing. Annalise had the door open and was running across the frozen yard in her nightgown and boots before the echo died, a burning piece of kindling in her hand for light. She found him inside the barn, sitting against the timber wall with the dead wolf across his legs. His left arm was torn from elbow to shoulder, where the animal's jaws had found purchase before the shot ended it. She did not panic. She had watched her mother close wounds on a working farm for 20 years. She got him inside, got the arm clean with boiled water and carbolic she found in his supply chest, packed the wound with a poultice of pine pitch and yarrow that she made from memory of her mother's teaching, and stitched the worst of it with a curved needle and gut thread by lamplight, while he sat absolutely still and looked at the wall and said nothing except, once with a tightness around his eyes, that she was doing fine. The fever came that night and lasted 2 days. She sat beside the rope bed and kept the fire and changed the dressings and read to him from the almanac when she didn't know what else to do, because it was what was there. On the second night, when the fever was at its worst and he was only half conscious, he reached out in the dark and found her hand on the blanket's edge and held it. Not tightly, just rested his large rough fingers over hers, and she let him, and they stayed that way until the fever broke just before dawn. When it broke, she cried briefly and quietly, facing the wall so he wouldn't see. She was not the homesteader's daughter anymore. She understood that clearly, alone in the pre-dawn silence of a limestone house in the cedar breaks above the Llano River. She was a woman who had found, without looking for it, the one she had long since stopped believing in. The thaw came late that year, arriving finally in March with the bluebonnets. The creek below the homestead ran clear and cold, and the kitchen garden showed its first pale green shoots, and the hill country put on the particular beauty it saves for the end of a hard winter, when every living thing that survived it knows exactly what it's worth. On a warm Tuesday morning in late March, with the sun coming full through the south windows, a rider came up the lower trail moving fast. He wasn't a stranger. Annalise recognized the gray wool suit from 40 yards. Drexler. Oak. He dismounted in the yard with 2 men behind him, both wearing the look of hired trouble. He had the leather satchel. He had a folded document in his hand. He walked toward the house with the precise, unhurried confidence of a man who has decided the law is on his side. Corbett came out of the barn at the sound of hooves. He stood in the yard with his arms loose at his sides and looked at Drexler the way he looked at everything, steadily, without rushing. Oak. The arrangement is concluded, Drexler said, not bothering with preamble. Winter has passed. I'm here to inform Miss Pryor that her father's property has been formally remanded into my trust pursuant to the original note terms. He held up the document. The $95 settled only the secondary balance. There was a third lien, Mr. Lane, which neither you nor her father was informed of. He smiled, the particular smile of a man who has structured a situation to require exactly this outcome. Okay. The land transfers at end of month. Unless, of course, Miss Pryor wishes to honor the Fredericksburg arrangement, which remains open. Corbett said nothing. Annalise came out of the house. She had the tin box from her room in her hands, the one she had packed along with the quilt and the boots and the daguerreotype. She walked past Corbett into the yard and stopped in front of Drexler. She opened the tin box. Oak. Inside, beneath the faded daguerreotype and the folded letter, was a document of her own. She had written to the county land office in Kerrville in January, a quiet, careful letter asking about the specific statute governing fraudulent secondary liens in Kerr County under the 1876 Texas Land Code. She had received, by February post, a 3-page reply from the county clerk which she had read 7 times, and a copy of the relevant statute which she had read 11. The third lien you're referring to, Annalise said, was recorded 6 days after the original note was signed without the knowledge or co-signature of the debtor, in direct violation of Section 14 of the 1876 Kerr County Land Code. She held up the county clerk's letter. A fraudulent secondary lien doesn't just fail, it voids the primary instrument entirely. My father's deed reverts clean. She looked at Drexler with the calm of a woman who has spent a winter learning exactly when to squeeze and not pull. You have no claim. The silence in the yard was long. One of the hired men behind Drexler shifted in his saddle. The other one looked at Corbett and seemed to do a quiet private calculation about the arithmetic of the situation. Drexler's smooth face worked through several expressions before settling on something that wasn't quite dignity. You'll have difficulty proving that in a county court, he said, but his voice had gone thin again in that particular way she'd noticed the first time, out on her father's homestead, when Corbett had walked out of the barn with the envelope. The county clerk's letter is already posted to Judge Harwell in Kerrville, Annalise said. He expects my formal deposition next Thursday. I'd recommend you not be in the county by then. Drexler looked past her at Corbett. Corbett looked back at him in complete silence. The land broker put the fraudulent document back in his satchel, clicked it shut, and mounted his horse without another word. His men followed. The 3 of them went back down the lower trail at a clip and did not return. Corbett stood beside her in the yard for a moment, watching the dust settle on the trail below. You wrote to the county clerk, he said. In January. She looked at the cedar ridgeline. Plenty of time to write letters when the creek is frozen and there's no garden to tend. He made a sound that was very nearly a laugh. It surprised her so thoroughly she turned to look at him. The corners of his eyes had creased. When did you know about the third lien? He asked. August. Drexler mentioned it to his associate at the San Antonio stockyards. My father's neighbor overheard and wrote to us. My father didn't know what to do with the information. I did. Corbett looked at her for a moment with an expression that she couldn't fully read, but that felt, in the warm March sunlight, like something close to pride. Your father's land is safe, she said. He nodded once. The bluebonnets were coming up along the fence line in full earnest by then, purple-blue and dense as a painted field, the hill country in its reckless spring generosity. Annalisa looked at them, and then she looked at the limestone house with its south-facing windows and its bookshelves, and the kitchen garden just waking up along the east wall. She looked at the 3 dogs sleeping in a patch of sun near the barn door. The winter contract had ended. She was free to go where she chose, as agreed. Her father's land was clear. There was nothing binding her to the cedar breaks above the Llano River. She reached into her coat pocket and found the oval brooch, the pewter frame still cool from the morning air. She turned it over and read the 3 scratched words on the back. For the girl. She had been the girl for a long time, Running from floods, from fires, from debt collectors in gray wool suits. She was tired of running. And she was standing in a yard full of bluebonnets, next to a man who had pulled her out of a current when she was 7 years old, and quietly kept her safe for 12 years after that, without asking her for a single thing in return. She turned to face him. "I'd like to stay," she said. Corbett Lane looked at her for a long moment in the way of a man who has learned to want very little and is suddenly being offered more than he has allowed himself to expect. Something shifted in his face, slow and careful and entirely real. "I'd like that," he said. The bluebonnets ran all the way down the ridge to the limestone creek bed, and the cedar waxwings moved through the treetops in their wavering flocks, and the hill country held them both in that particular spring silence that is not empty but full of the weight of a long winter survived, a debt paid, a name finally spoken, and two people standing on solid ground, choosing without obligation or fear to remain.